Chapter 6. Butcher. Why did you bring her here? I shrugged and gave Armand my most bored expression. I didn't. She brought me. I warned you we were coming. He glowered at me, arms crossed as his eyes glimmered and shifted, only a little bit, but I should probably loosen my stance and check my knives. I specifically warned her against coming to Border Town. When? Tonight. I smiled at him. I don't recall you being at Candlestick tonight. He glowered at me. The Greek wanted to see her. I winced. I'd really hoped that the Greek would forget about her and vice versa. What did he want? He shrugged. Like I understand him. They bonded over hair and pizza, so now he thinks she's his pet. Wants to make sure the butchers are taking care of the fuzzy little sweater girl. I still had her fluffy green sweater in my room at Calder. I wanted to keep it. Until I had her in my room at Calder, or wherever she wanted to stay. My stomach lurched at the thought of Violetta in my bed, my room, my life like that. The CM thought I should marry her. Soon. You look a little bit sick. I don't think he's a serious threat. Otherwise I would have ended him. I shook my head and glanced out the window to study Violetta where she sat. With her head bent, completely focused on the phone, the last traces of her mother. The CM thinks I should marry her before Harmony gets here. He made a choking sound that I wasn't sure was laughter or something else. He grinned at me and shook his head. The CM has come a long way. He doesn't want you to abandon the butchers and take up with vampires, does he? I glared at him. The vampire lifestyle doesn't appeal to me. Well, you can't be a werewolf. I shook my head. There are certainly enough daughtry werewolves in the world. How many wolves do you have here? You told her that you knew how many there were. His eyes gleamed. I slowly smiled back at him. I meant the city. You have 32 wolves. Here. 31, one of them took off while I was fixing the roof. You think she needs that much protection? He shrugged. The girl cured werewolves. We don't have a precedent for this. I don't suppose we do. What do you know about the city's seals? The werewolf seal, the vampire seal, and the zombie seal? I shook my head. No, in a cellar somewhere a couple of brass lids hold back some really bad stuff. He raised his eyebrow. I don't think you're supposed to talk to werewolves about that kind of thing. I'm actually sure of it. I grinned at him. Thanks for the reminder. Apparently the mysterious renegade leader had Sebastian and Anthony go down and bleed on the seals. That's why this year's darkness is extra thick. He growled at me. Not for werewolf ears. I widened my eyes at him. Excuse me, is this too much responsibility for you to handle? Don't worry. I just thought you should know that a couple of butchers are going down into the depths tonight to check it out. His jaw clenched. Why should I know about that? With butchers otherwise occupied, tonight would be a good night for a werewolf slaughter. Don't you think? He growled, a long low sound, and I could tell his hackles were up at least. His metaphorical hackles. The CM thinks this broken seals problem is my problem. I patted his shoulder. I really enjoyed making him uncomfortable. If you were running away from responsibility, you probably shouldn't have become pack leader. Also, this monster is targeting your kind. What seems like a former butcher turned vampire or something else even more dangerous. I wonder what butcher would want to destroy you. He showed his teeth in what may have looked like a smile to someone else. Has it ever occurred to you that I wasn't running from anything? I took a step away from him. No, it hasn't. I'll see you. He growled. Keep her out of Border Town. I cocked my head. I'll keep her safe. I'm not locking her up. She's my baker. Not my pet. There's something wild about her. If I try to hold on to her too tight, she'll disappear. If she ends up in Border Town alone, she'll disappear all right. Get her back to Candlestick. My wolves want to meet her. And that would be such a bad thing? He scowled at me. She's terrified of Mrs. Maverly. She doesn't need to know that her good friend Armand thinks about eating her every time he sees her. As long as that's the only thing you want to do to her. He laughed and slapped my shoulder. That would be funny if anything else. Wouldn't kill her. Get out or I'll eat you. Fun chat. Violetta glanced at me when I got in the car, stuffing the phone away and trying not to sniffle. Her emotions were fascinating to me. Her sadness as beautiful in its way as her glowing happiness. It was my job to make her happy, to protect her life, health, and happiness. I held her against me because she needed me but didn't want to need anyone. I'd worked so hard to stay away from her, to not pour my energy into her every moment, to take her and carry her somewhere far away and keep her safe and mine. I cared so much. It was worth it, though, watching her bloom as a baker, knowing that I wasn't the only one who would protect her with my life, having Landry to watch over her, keeping her away from every butcher who might be a threat. He'd always had an open kitchen where butchers could come and go, but not anymore. He watched me when I was with her but didn't try to keep me away. He knew me well enough to know that only my own concern for her would influence me about something I wanted so much. I could be willful at the best of times. With Landry as her guardian, I didn't need to be quite as protective and overbearing as I might be otherwise. I drove with her against me, her arms around my waist, head on my shoulder, seatbelt stretched past the point of usefulness. I should say something about her mom, but what? I tightened my arm around her and felt the steady ebb and flow of my energy into her. By the time we reached Candlestick, I felt loose and heavy, but only enough for it to be very hard to pull away from her. I couldn't. I sat there in the garage, away from prying eyes, and hoped that somehow she'd decide that she needed to kiss me. Orion, what are you going to do after you're finished being a butcher? I cleared my throat. Become the CM after my father, and be responsible for all the other butchers under my jurisdiction. Somehow I doubted she wanted to hear that. But it was true. There was a balance between truth and diplomacy that I tried to keep. If I told Violetta the truth from the beginning without softening her up a bit, she'd run into the woods and never come back. Like if I told her that my father only allowed our relationship to flourish in Candlestick because he wanted her to give him grandchildren, the reaction wouldn't be good. I'm going to college next year, but I'll probably still butcher. It's a seasonal thing. The paperwork is eternal, but the actual nightly battles are only intense from October to January. She looked up at me, only the side of her face visible in the dim light. So, it's like an extracurricular that you can keep up as long as you like? What about Landry? Is it seasonal for him? Good question. He bakes less intensely most of the year than these dark days. He's kind of boring though. Doesn't do much besides hang around in his indecent swimwear around the pool in the summer. You're kind of lucky that you didn't see him in the off-season. She giggled, her body shaking against mine. I definitely preferred her, trembling from laughter to fear. It's so strange to me, the way that all of you live like this is normal. I thought I'd try it and then go to college in the fall, start my real life. There's no reason to wait. You can take classes in January starting with a new semester. You're brilliant, so for you to balance academics with baking will be nothing. Why not be a baker and whatever else you want to go into? Bumped her head with my chin. What else do you want to do? She hesitated. I thought botany like my mother, and maybe chemistry with a culinary arts degree. That does sound indecisive. I exhaled. That sounded like precisely the sort of academics that would lend themselves to her staying close to me. Calder University is renowned for its chemistry and botany programs. She elbowed me, but gently. You're making that up. I laughed and grinned at her. I would have, but I didn't have to. Honestly. Google it. Calder has amazing programs in science. The math program isn't bad either. They do not have a gymnastics team though. Isn't it a boys' college? I shook my head. Gender neutral, although most of the students are men. Most are also butchers or from butcher families who are no longer practicing. She looked up and let go of me to trace my cheek with her fingers. What does that mean, no longer practicing? I cleared my throat as she continued stroking my face, each touch sending a thrill of pleasure through me. Some families lose their ability to change into butchers over time, but you never know. Sometimes there's a throwback. And those families are still viable options for marriage. Marriage, I'd said the word and it hadn't come out strangled. Viable options? That sounds medieval. I laughed, but it was half strangled. How could I possibly broach this topic? Well, have you seen the architecture? Medieval is kind of our thing. Although the cars are a definite improvement. So, she said hesitantly, and I held my breath. You can only marry people who have butcher ancestors. No. I can marry whoever I want, but my children won't be great butchers. Unless. So that's why Olivia was the one, so that your children could be really great butchers. I took a tiny breath. Something like that. She has good lines. Violetta laughed, but not quite a cute giggle. She did not like me saying that. Olivia had good lines. I meant her ancestry is good, not her personal lines. She laughed again and pulled away from me, taking my face in her hands. Orion, can I kiss you? I exhaled in relief. I thought you'd never ask. She sucked on her bottom lip while she studied me. One thing. My Aunt Lottie always looked down on my mom. Was it because my mom has bad lines and does that mean that I'm not? I cut her off, cupping her cheek and glaring at her. You cured werewolves. Clearly your mother had very strong lines, just like your father. She blinked at me and I realized that I'd been a little too rough. But my aunt didn't want my mother with her brother. I'm sure it wasn't your lines. Your lines are perfect. I brushed her lips with mine and my heart thrummed from that contact. But not as good as your lines, she whispered, tangling her fingers in my hair and kissing me a little bit longer. You cured werewolves. Your lines are going to be legendary. I kissed her, lingering on her soft lips, the hunger growing with every touch, every brush against her. When she kissed me in earnest, twisting until she was on my lap, I had to hold myself very firmly to keep my instincts from taking over. I let her kiss me, barely reciprocating because I wanted so much to pull her against me and make her feel adored. Beyond that was a very real danger of me becoming lost in her or losing myself and hurting her balance. She pulled away and stared at me, her eyes luminous. I wasn't going to kiss you until I decided whether I liked you for you or your energy. Interesting and terrifying. What's the verdict? She shook her head. I like both so much it's impossible to say. Are you going to need to take polar bear placenta every time I kiss you?
Ich grinste her.
I felt very much like I wanted to taste her and nothing else. For the rest of my life. That wasn't a good sign. Probably. Landry hasn't forbidden me to kiss you. That's also good. She frowned at me. Why would he do that? I waved my hand around, ending with my fingers brushing over her soft hair. Oh, I don't know. Something about bakers protecting each other. Her lips pursed, her beautiful lips. I couldn't help but kiss her, only for a moment that became 2 and then 3 before I managed to pull away. She shook her head at me. It's your sexy car. It makes you irresistible. The Greek wants me to be able to defend myself against butchers. I nodded. Good idea. You should be able to defend yourself against Greeks, too. I gripped her fingers. That Armand had watched the bogeyman's encounter with Violetta didn't quite assure me for some reason. She cocked her head at me. Why don't you get along with him?
Ido.
I think I'm going there for my next haircut. Do you want to come with me? It can be a date. She wrinkled her adorable nose. I've heard of those things, but I think they're mythical. Next week, Monday, we'll go to the botanical gardens. I'll take you directly. After school. It closes at 5. How about we meet there? I hesitated. It was far from border town, but still, letting Violetta go anywhere unescorted was unthinkable. I'd arrange someone to look after her. I'd talk to Landry. Maybe he could give her a ride and hang around until I got there. That wouldn't be at all strange. I smiled. Perfect. 3:15. 3:45. I sighed. You don't want me to break any traffic laws. You're such a good influence. And then on Wednesday we're going to throw knives. And then on Saturday, haircut. Is that too much? She laughed and grinned at me. I don't think that I could ever get too much of you or Ian Daughtry. I kissed her again. How could I possibly resist, but I managed to pull away. Before the CM said anything, he was in the shadows of the garage watching, making certain that I didn't do anything reckless, like kiss a baker. I hadn't noticed him come in, which said how wrapped up I was in Violetta. After I walked her to the bottom of the steps, the ones that led to her turret, she frowned at me. I took too much energy from you. You must be hungry. I shrugged. There's always Landry's bread. And polar bear placenta. She wrinkled her nose and shook her head. To be honest, I can't sleep. I have to bake. I don't even know what, which means it's probably going to be awful. What time are you leaving tonight? I checked the time, which wasn't how most people check time. Could feel night coming on, the darkness coming to life. Soon. It will probably be a long night. She dragged me away from the stairs and to the kitchen where she rummaged around until she found the pink tablets that I took without complaint. Kissing her was worth any price. The tablets were like getting a shot of adrenaline. She packed a small bag with a variety of baked goods and sent me on my way. I stood in the doorway while she moved to the flour bin to begin her baking. Watched her for a few minutes before I finally turned and headed to my father's office. He stood at the board, which was empty except for one card with Tansetta murders in the center of it. Did you warn the werewolves? He asked without turning around. I did. Armand was delighted. Indeed. You're taking Sebastian with you tonight. I inhaled deeply but didn't say anything. If he wasn't going to mention me kissing Violetta, I wouldn't complain about anything. It's almost time. The darkness is growing. Will you need retirees tonight?
No.
I don't want too many butchers out, just enough to show that we're fighting the right demons. There hasn't been any sign of renegades since All Hallows. He glanced over at me, his eyes concerned. You seem well satisfied. Thank you. He raised an eyebrow. I knew perfectly well that had been a warning not to get cocky instead of a compliment. Tonight will be arduous. Don't push yourself too much. I grinned at him. I'll make a point of it. Casper and Merlot will also be with you. I stopped smiling. Will they? He nodded. We've given her a week of isolation, but this is the butcher headquarters. She has to become accustomed to other butchers and they have to get used to her. I inhaled deeply. And if a butcher oversteps himself? His lips twitched. You mean taking advantage of her, kissing her? Touching her against her will? He shook his head. Landry will oversee her. And you'll oversee Landry. I'll oversee you. Any other butcher she'll fight off and he will pay the consequences. You are the only actual risk. I scowled at him. Her mother left for some reason. Yes. He frowned and shook his head. He knew but didn't want to tell me? I already knew that Landry was Violetta's father, so the mother had to have been close to him. Bakers marrying bakers was perfectly acceptable. Of course, Landry had been a butcher first. Had he had the sort of relationship with Violetta's mother that I wanted with her? Her taking his energy and baking for him? No, of course not. Did Landry hurt her? My dad frowned at me. Not that way. I feel that it's not my story to tell. But you should know. Laurel was assaulted by a butcher, after she interned here with Landry and they became close. Laurel came to me, told me that a butcher had forced his energy on her, but I didn't believe her. The butcher in question was very well known, respected, and she had no proof. Landry still hasn't forgiven me for that. That's why she turned her back on our world. Because I chose to believe a butcher over her. When she asked Landry to join her, he refused loyalty to butchers and all that, which was only another betrayal to her. He didn't know about the charges until later, after I interviewed bakers about that butcher and dug up a few interesting facts about his lack of respect for bakers and women. I clenched my jaw for a moment before I could speak in a calm voice. You're the reason that the Tansettas weren't protected. He shrugged and ran a hand over his face. I'm the CM, so everything is my responsibility. Judging correctly is essential. I failed. Since then I've made certain that bakers are revered in our district. It hasn't always been so, but since I've made rigorous requirements, we've been getting steadily better bakers, and the whole district has prospered, at least until your brother. But you're the CM, so you're responsible for that as well. He gave me a hard glance. Yes. I'm not making the same demands on you as we put on him, because that resulted in disaster. And if that was the wrong choice, it will also be my responsibility. If you end up hurting her, I will personally take your skin from your flesh. You're welcome to. I hesitated. That was the first we've kissed since she came to stay. I know. I turned and stalked out. That night's hunt was fairly intense, but with Casper, Merlot and Sebastian around me, the rest of the butchers spread out behind, we weren't overrun. Midnight to 3 a.m. we fought above Border Town, pushing back the zombies and an unfortunate group of wraiths, pushing until the battle was won for the night. I turned to my bakers and raised my whip. They hurrahed and raised their whips in return before they headed back through the streets to the courtyard where the bakers' goods waited. I accompanied them but fell in beside Sebastian on the way. After we get some bread, you're going to lead us to the broken seal. He turned to stare at me for a second before he nodded. Olivia took her place close to him and bumped him with her hip. He staggered almost into me before recovering. Olivia had extremely capable hips. Olivia. I nodded at her, then moved away from the pair. Olivia, apparently feeling like flirting with a butcher after a hunt, wasn't at all awkward. The other butchers tried not to look at her, except Francis, who stared at the two with a wide grin on his face. At the courtyard, a butcher's boy came up to me, his eyes tired from being on delivery duty for the night. "Orion, Landry sent these to you special." I took the bundle he handed me, but when I inhaled, it wasn't Landry but Violetta I smelled. She'd given me something very special. Sausage stuffed rolls. I ate most of them, then stuck them into my pockets for later. And maybe I'd share with Merlot and Sebastian. Maybe. Not Casper. Casper grinned and came up to me, eyeing my bulging pockets. "So tonight's just begun. Are you fed?" He nodded. "Moderately. I imagine you've been fed a much more satisfying supper than I've ever had. Is it the kissing that enhances her baking, or is it her baking that makes her impossible to stop kissing?" I ignored him and broke into a jog. Merlot came alongside me soon enough then. Sebastian's footsteps pounded until he caught up with our small group. Sebastian took the lead, his pace quick. We moved quickly, quietly, holding to the shadows. The only monsters we found we took care of quickly, silently. Before continuing on our way, we reached a field and Sebastian scrambled in the ground until he pulled up a worn trapdoor. I held it open for Merlot and Casper to descend ahead of me. Gave the empty field one last glance before heading down. "Maybe should have done this during the day," Merlot muttered ahead of us. Sebastian held a flare as he walked ahead, apparently fearless in the face of who knew what. I went slower, taking my time as we passed shelves of antique pickles and peaches, through another narrow door into a small passage that descended in uneven steps until it came out in a square space with a wooden door in the floor. Sebastian opened it and began down an old ladder that groaned beneath his weight. I put my arm on Casper when he was about to descend, one at a time. Merlot nodded at me. He appreciated caution. Strange he wasn't a CM of course he'd never had connection. We stood in the dark, feet below ground, waiting for Sebastian to wave the flare below. After that, Casper went, leaving me with Merlot. "I'd watch out for him," he said barely under his breath. He looked down after Casper. "Do you think that he's a danger?" Merlot glanced at me. I knew what he meant. Casper was a danger. Probably to Violetta. Casper's a fine butcher, but there's a reason he doesn't have his own district. "And you, there a reason that you don't?" He gave me a thin smile. "Indeed. You know perfectly well." I put my hand on his shoulder. "You're an excellent butcher." He studied me soberly. "It takes all kinds. I don't connect much. Casper connects too much, and you are just right." I pulled my hand away. "It's not connection that makes the butcher. No, it's connection that makes the CM. It's interesting, his decision to upset conventions and allow you to connect so deeply with a baker." I cleared my throat, looking past him into the hole where Casper was nearly to the bottom. "Indeed. Do you think anyone will object?" Merlot shrugged. "It's not the first time it's happened. There are reasons to go both ways. After what she did with the wolves and you, it's hard to know. You'll probably have competition coming, though, soon if I don't miss my guess." He turned and headed down into the pit, leaving me to exhale deeply and try to think about seals instead of bakers. Merlot was right. If the CM allowed me access to Violetta, there was no reason he wouldn't allow others the same, if she chose. I rubbed the back of my neck until finally Merlot jumped off the end of the ladder. I climbed down quickly, silently, until I reached the floor of the immense cavern. Merlot, Casper, and Sebastian were all in different directions, stooping to check for strange scents and searching the enormous space. When I got to the floor, I whistled low and headed for Sebastian. He'd let the flare go out, so we were operating in pitch black. Didn't bother any of us. Darkness only made our other senses stronger. I followed him until he reached the center of the space, or at least closer to the center and away from the one wall. "Here it is," he whispered. I bent down and felt the rim of a 2-foot hole. It didn't have a lid on it. An icy breeze wafted from the pit, like a wraith over my wrist. I turned on a light, shining it around the perimeter of the hole, then took pictures of the marks in the uneven stone around the edges. The marks were butcher marks of protection, safety, and the metal rim bore the same. "Show me the other seals." He led me to 2 other spots that had brass lids. I took pictures of the words and images graven into them, then stopped, staring at the center seal and the warning on it. Whoso breaks the seals will surely pay the price in blood. Once undone thrice. Must be made anew. Beware. Darkness and men and monsters brood. To the butchers. Ye must be true. The first one said the same thing, Sebastian said in a low voice just behind my shoulder, making me jump. I turned on him with a glare. And you decided that meant you should bleed on it. He shrugged. We had to pay the price in blood to break the seal. Why did they put it backwards like that? It's a warning, Merlot hissed low. You aren't done paying for that in blood. And your blood doesn't mean your personal blood, but the blood of your fellow butchers. What happened to trying to be quiet? Casper asked, his own voice loud. I rolled my eyes, not that anyone could see. The question is whether we should scale down into this pit beyond the broken seal, or whether we should return with the information we have. They all stopped moving and talking. I just suggested that we all climb down into hell. Why would I do that? I studied the ground with the light and noticed that outside of the 3 seals were overlapping circles drawn into the stone, the section where all 3 circles crossed in the precise center of the seals. I squatted down on that ground and pressed my palm to the ground. Connection. I could feel them beneath the stone. Only it wasn't the stone that held them back, but the seals. Without the other 2 seals, would there even be a stone floor? Possibly not. I shivered as I listened to the darkness below snarl. And then I felt when it went quiet and began listening to me. We're leaving now, I said and turned, but something was pouring out of the open pit. I took out a special weapon from inside my coat, a kind of crossbow, loaded with energy pulse, and shot at the nearest part of the monster. It was one creature, a gelatinous blob with a multitude of limbs and one luminous. It came out like water, falling upright with a gurgling sound 20 feet above us. The pulse went off then, sending a shimmering wave of light and energy through the creature, which illuminated the enormous cavern that dripped stalagmites 40 feet above. The flash made the walls sparkle blues, greens, and golds before it was suddenly dark, and the creature rotated its eye in my direction. What is that? Sebastian whispered. Mirthith, I answered easily, tossing the crossbow to him. Let me see if I can remember how to kill it. I was obsessed with mythical monsters when I was a kid, and my dad thought I was wasting my time. You couldn't chop off its limbs. Its eye was its only vulnerable point. Threw a dagger at the glowing orb and it went through the eye to the blob past it and began to dissolve. No, that was Cyclops. Mirthith died from dehydration. Fire then. Only the amount of fire required to kill this guy would also kill us. Do you all have holy water? Sebastian shot the thing with the electrical pulse which lit up the cavern. Again, the monster turned, sent a massive limb across the ground like a gelatinous wave. Set heat explosives for count 10. Far side from the ladder, away from the seals. Sebastian, watch yourself. You've left enough blood down here. Sebastian barely dodged over the wave of a limb rolling over the floor. I had my own to avoid, but it was simple enough to duck and roll while throwing irritants towards it that kept it moving towards me, away from the seals and the ladder on the other side. I threw a small vial of acid at the monster. Hissed and bubbled on contact while slightly silvery goo leaked from its broken skin. Casper, don't waste your time trying to cut him. Prep your explosive. Merlot glared at me while he ducked beneath a swipe of the monster's limb. This plan doesn't seem all that well thought out. I shrugged and began counting down. Sebastian moved close to place another explosive practically beneath it, getting his arm slashed by the blob monster. Sebastian gasped from pain at that contact, and then it was time. I took a deep breath and took out a ball of holy water, triggered it and felt the tightness as it exploded around me, the skin of water keeping me balanced. In it, floating around like the other butchers. Casper wasn't in his ball of holy water. The sound of explosion came from far away, but my vision through the water showed the red-orange ball of heat as it shot us away from the creature. I hit the wall, the water tension broke and I fell to the ground, dripping until the heat seared me, drying that side of my body. I lay there, with my hands over my head, the sound echoing through the cavern until it passed and I couldn't feel heat above my fingers. That may have been because I didn't have any fingers. I raised my head and the cavern was empty, nothing left of the blobby monster besides a splatter of goo on the walls. Casper was Singed more than Merlot, who was rolling to his feet, rubbing his shoulder, or Sebastian, where he still lay spread-eagled near the ladder. I pulled out a sausage roll and munched it while I headed to the ladder. I tossed a roll to Casper, who ate it with eyes still wide and movements jerky. I grabbed Sebastian by the back of the coat and dragged him upright before I pointed my small device at the ceiling, pushed the lever, and then both of us shot up on the lead string very quickly until with a jerk we stopped, my hair brushing the ceiling. I pushed him to the top of the ladder and he managed to climb up. I followed, and soon Casper and Merlot came after me. I closed the trapdoor and took out another roll, handing one to Sebastian. Before I ate another. How did we get out so fast? Sebastian asked. I pulled out the device, then put it back in my pocket. Butchers have the best gadgets. You're going to love being the butcher. I studied the trapdoor before I walked to the edge of the room and laid down pins and wires that would explode beautifully if anything tried to come out from that side. Gadgets. Sebastian's eyes were enormous in his face, and his nose was smudged. Casper patted his shoulder with his loose fingers. That's right. We also get the best monsters. The girls are never going to believe me. I don't suppose any of you got pictures. I laughed and stood, taking another sausage roll out of my pocket and chewing on it. I wasn't sure what it was supposed to do, but I felt like a king. That plan had been extremely idiotic but had worked pretty well considering. I headed back along the low corridor, hunching down until I got to the cellar and the dusty old jars. It was halfway to the trapdoor when I stopped and held up my hand for the other butchers to stop. I closed my eyes and inhaled. Couldn't smell anything other than ancient dust, but there was something, presence above us. Was it wraiths? Was it vampires? Zombies? Whatever it was. There were a lot. What? I cut off Casper with my hand on his lips and backed us to the small doorway. We'd no sooner gotten there than the ceiling of the cellar caved in. It only took one small explosion to clear enough space for us to crawl out into a confusion of monsters. I tossed rolls to my butchers, pulled out my knives and ran into the horde with a smile. I spun and slashed, feeling the wind in my hair as I slid through the darkness that had no chance of catching me. My heart pounded slowly as I moved, every thrust precise and inspired. I fought with the strength of 100 butchers, every death sharpening the hunger inside me. I fought as one, possessed, my butchers behind me, until a howl in the distance cut through the keening hunger. Werewolves attacked the edges, ripping at the monsters until the darkness fled, broken on my spear point, and their harrying. They dispersed while I chased them from the middle of that field deep in the darkness and laughed. Was terribly alive and burning with hunger for another death. They vanished too quickly, leaving me with a rising sunrise in Armand's fist. He hit me in the face, contact I barely noticed even though I tasted my own blood. He gripped my coat lapels and shook me. Are you stupid as well as mad? I kept laughing until he pulled me close and hissed into my ear. And Vanilla? How is she this night with her butcher trying to get himself killed? I blinked and let him put his hand in my pocket and shove a roll in my mouth. Armand turned and walked into the ranks of his wolves, shifting as he went. Followed, leaving the zombies to shamble away. I ate more rolls as we walked, until I could think rational thoughts. What in the world had that been? When I looked back at my butchers, I had to remind myself that they weren't my butchers, at least Casper and Merlot. They were beneath the CM, not me, but they followed me as one connection. Merlot nodded at me while I flinched and turned away. I wasn't wise enough to be a CM, but as the CM no one could tell me how often I could kiss Violetta. My mouth watered and I ate another biscuit and another, but there weren't enough biscuits in the world to stop me from craving Violetta. Was I more mindless after kissing her? I was certainly more enthusiastic. Chapter 7. Baker. Orion wasn't there the next morning, but his friend Casper was. I ignored him. As I baked under Landry's watchful eye still, it was strange to have him loafing around in the kitchen all morning, eating and eating and eating. Landry never left while he was there, and I couldn't help but wonder about the Greek's warning. Casper, I said as I rolled out dough, tell me about vampires. Do crosses and holy water work on them? He finished chewing his bread before he nodded. Crossbows and holy water. Bombs, sure. Oh. I stared at him and thought about crossbows and bombs. What about garlic? He smiled at me, a rakish smile beneath the sweep of his blonde hair. If I found one of his hairs in my rolls, I'd kill him. They don't like garlic. Who does? Vile stuff. They're not crazy about any strong antibacterial oils. Rosemary, ginger, that sort of thing. You don't need to worry about vampires, though. Your butchers will protect you. Butchers in the plural? Who would those be? I didn't ask, I just smiled and pounded on the dough. The weekend flew by in a flurry of baking as several visiting butchers came, visited the kitchen and spoke in low voices to Landry without glancing at me. Well, much. I did catch one or two disapproving glances and a few lingering looks as though they wanted to see whether I could really have brought werewolves back. I didn't pay much attention to it, not when I had vast quantities of food to prepare. On Sunday it was strangely quiet with no baking in the kitchen whatsoever. I went to mass with Landry when he invited me, but we didn't go with all the butchers, but to a glorious cathedral downtown with stained glass, a beautiful choir and ordinary people. I sat in my pew and felt a little bit of the stress leach out of my shoulders. None of the congregation were part of that world. They were all ordinary people who were doing their best. Landry leaned over and whispered, "This is what keeps back the darkness." The citizens of our city weren't all fighting back the darkness in their own way. We couldn't do anything but abandon the city and build a wall so high that nothing could come out. I turned to glance up at him, his blonde hair catching the red light of the stained glass, a red halo. "Is it possible to build such a wall?" He shrugged. "Of course. You've heard of the Wall of China. There's another wall built down in South America, Africa, when the darkness grew too great to fight back. Now we are living in a time of such modern wonders and with enough butchers to hold back the darkness on every front. At least most." He frowned for a moment before he gave me a slight smile and turned back to face the priest as he led the procession from the back of the church. I wanted to ask Landry more, like, was there darkness everywhere or only some places, and if so, what made those places susceptible? Were there some places in the world untouched by vampires, zombies and wraiths? I inhaled deeply of incense and wood polish, smoothed my hands over my pink skirt and listened to the chanting. When we got back to Candlestick, Orion waited in the driveway for me. When I saw him standing there, dressed in black with his long dark hair falling across his slanted cheekbones and delicious lips, my stomach tightened and my heart pounded faster. My mouth also watered, but I didn't want to focus on that. He opened the door for me and took my hand, his fingers warm around mine. Hadn't seen him since Friday. Seemed like such a long time ago. "I have a meeting to go to, but I wanted to make sure you're still planning on going to the garden with me tomorrow." Also, he was holding my hand, letting I wanted to stretch on my tiptoes and kiss him, sliding my hands through his silky strands and drown in bliss, but Landry stood there, watching us from the other side of the car. I squeezed his hand back. Of course. 3:45. I wouldn't miss it. I shivered. Half because he was so delicious, half because the cold November breeze was swirling around my bare legs. He frowned and stepped closer until I could feel the strength and warmth emanating into me. "Let's go in. Landry, I'll walk with her while you park." He didn't look away and I couldn't break the warm chocolate brown gaze. Didn't want to. We walked into the house and I dropped his hand. There were several older butchers standing around whispering in hushed voices, and the looks Orion and I got together were a bit scandalized. I stopped meeting eyes and instead focused on the gray stone floors until I finally descended the long low steps that led into the kitchen. "You can go," I said, turning, but he moved close, sliding his hands around my waist, not pulling me against him but making contact that made me want more. "I'm not sure I can. I missed you yesterday. Why didn't you come?" He made a face. "Research. Seals and mythical monsters, that kind of thing." Inhaled so much dust I sneezed for an hour. At least. I patted his head. "Poor baby. So that's what the sausage rolls were for." His smile faded. "Endurance, vigor, and boosted senses. Maybe dust as well. Your baking is miraculous." Landry cleared his throat. "The meeting is about to begin. If you don't want to be on your father's bad side, you should probably not be tardy." Orion's hands tightened on my waist before he forced a smile and let me go, stepping back, which felt terribly wrong. Tomorrow. The botanicals gardens closed at 5. I was going to meet Orion at 3:45, but I wanted to spend time before that, perhaps follow the path around the pond in the Japanese garden with its twisted bonsai trees. I could watch the koi and maybe think about what I wanted. After lunch I told Landry that I was Finished for the day, and he nodded absently while he rolled out breadsticks. He looked distracted while his hands rubbed the dough back and forth into beautiful long strands he'd roll in sesame seeds. I went upstairs, changed, called a cab on my phone, then went outside, walking down the drive towards the gate where the cab would be. I slipped through the side gate, waving at the guard in his little building. It was automated but still guarded. Was he a butcher? Not something I could ask. I stood there, glad for my jeans and warm jacket while I waited. The drive was uneventful, the cabbie talking about the chances for a good hockey season until we got to the drive that led to the tall glass building, filled with enormous glass flower sculptures in dizzying hues. After I paid the cabbie, I walked in, feeling like my mother might be waiting in the garden for me. She wouldn't, of course, but for a moment my heart rose. Anyway, there weren't a lot of people there that day, and as I walked along the paved path beside the pond, the quiet interrupted by a distant splash of a fish or the rustle of leaves, I had enough quiet to finally work through the thoughts in my head. Didn't seem real. Werewolves, vampires, but I could hardly dismiss the butchers in their candlestick manner. None of them were role-playing. Orion was the most serious and determined person I'd ever met. He'd truly been poisoned, and I'd truly saved him with Jell-O. My brother Sebastian had grown into a monster-killing machine, and I was a baker, or at least I could be one if I wanted. I sat down on a bench and stared across the water at the distant bridge and perfectly pruned tree, arcing over the water, its reflection spreading into the sky. My inexperience was a definite disadvantage. I'd fallen desperately in love with Orion while at school, pretending to buy my brother. Now I could still hardly believe that he liked me, much less wanted to touch me and be with me as much as I wanted to be with him. It was all too sudden, too irrational. He was my first love, and while my parents had had a very good marriage, surely my father was not the first man my mother ever loved. They didn't talk about how they met. They didn't talk about much before Bess and I were born, no doubt because of my mother's refusal to speak about bakers or butchers. But they must have talked to Bess, or he wouldn't know to join the butchers. I would have a good long talking to with him. I heard a branch snap and turned to glance over my shoulder into the trees that swayed in the sun. When I turned back, a deeply hooded figure stood in front of me. She lifted her head enough that I caught a glimpse of blood-red eyes before she glanced down and took one ominous step in my direction. I sat there staring at her stupidly while my heart took off like a jackrabbit, and my brain did absolutely nothing for long seconds until she took another step towards me. She moved like water or oil, something inhumanly graceful about her, but I was still processing that flash of face, beautiful yet terrifying, and it hadn't seemed like she had any hair. I sat there feeling like I was going to throw up, paralyzed by fear, and she took another step closer. After another step, she lifted her head and looked at me again, her face deep in shadows but still luminous, beautiful. Child, are you brave or foolish? I frowned at her. I certainly wasn't brave, so foolish would be the only option, but honestly she was walking towards me like a predator, clearly trying to get me to take off into the woods behind me where no one could see her, suck my blood, or whatever she wanted to do. Neither. What do you want? She smiled then, blood-red lips revealing a flash of sharp teeth, fangs included. I think both. You believe that since you can cure werewolves you can survive a vampire. I swallowed. She knew who I was. This wasn't an accident then. How had she found me? I was right about her being a vampire, and I was talking to her. Probably was too stupid. I slipped my hand into my bag and she moved, grabbing my arm in her cold vice-like grip, the smell of old blood on her breath as she hissed at me. I ripped open the lid of the jar with my other hand and pulled out the toothpicks I'd been soaking in oil since my conversation with Casper. Stabbed her in the face with them, feeling far away like my hand belonged to someone else, short practical nails clinging to the little sticks that I shoved into that skin, the sound of sizzling flesh only audible for a moment before she threw me, using my arm as a handle, tossing me like a doll through the bushes and into the dark woods behind the bench before she was on me again. She grabbed me, lifting me up in the shadowed woods, her hood falling back to reveal a very bald head, and her face now imperfect as though she had unsightly acne where the toothpicks had been. She held me by my head, my skull carefully balanced in her hand as her eyes grew red like welling blood. Could see my blood in her eyes, the craving for my blood growing and growing. Something hit her from the side and I went flying again. I tucked and only hit my leg against a tree before I scrambled up to see the most terrifying thing I'd ever imagined. No, I'd never imagined anything like that before. A man-wolf circled with her, his head all wolf, body mostly man with feet and hands of wolf. They moved together in a flash of fur and a swirl of her black cloak before they came apart, the wolf growling and snapping while she gazed at him in perfect silence, not even breathing. I backed away from the two, as quietly as I could with my limping until I was far enough that I could turn and move towards the nearest wall. The street beyond that would be full of cars and people, and I'd be much safer in the middle of the road than here in the woods. I reached the wall and scrambled up, my fingers strong as I pressed into the cracks until I reached the top. Fell over, rolling down the small patch of grass to the sidewalk, for the moment deserted, but half a block away was an intersection that would be busy with traffic on an afternoon at 2 or 3. I ran, ignoring the agony in my leg, and didn't stop until I was in the center of the road, cars weaving away from me. I pulled out my phone and called Orion with shaky fingers. He answered at the first ring. Violetta, where are you? I'm in the middle of the road. It's daytime. Why are vampires running around in the middle of the day? They're not supposed to do that, are they? What about werewolves? It's not a full moon. It's not any moon. The rules are completely wrong. The only good thing was that the garlic definitely worked. Think I need something other than toothpicks. I thought I was being paranoid. Why wasn't I being paranoid? I don't want to run around with a knife on my leg all the time. Do knives even work? Maybe toothpicks were better than knives. You know, mini steaks and all that. Violetta, take a breath. Calm down. On the southwest corner of the garden. Yes, I whispered while I tried to not be hysterical. I was standing in the middle of the road with something terribly wrong with my leg, and I had to be rational, calm. I see you. I looked up in time to see Orion fall onto the sidewalk seemingly from the sky and walk towards me briskly, chewing on something. He smiled at me and lifted his hand, the one that had a roll. My roll? I smiled back and waved. When I stepped towards him instinctively, a car honked at me and swerved while I jumped back and held my breath for a second. With my eyes closed, I was fine. Of course, everything was perfectly fine. Orion scooped me up in his arms and I buried my face into his neck, inhaling his skin and feeling like everything might be truly all right at some point. He sighed heavily and held me close as he carried me in some direction. Probably through cars, but I wasn't interested in watching. I couldn't see anything else. Ever again. I was being an idiot. Dramatic stupid. Yep, I was. I clung to him tighter and pressed my cheek to his throat until I felt him swallow with difficulty. Are you all right? I pulled away to stare at him. His lips twisted and he pulled me back against him. Stupid question. Do you want to talk about it now while I carry you in the general direction of Candlestick, or do you want to wait until we get somewhere safe? He sounded slightly raspy, like I was strangling him, which I was. I loosened my grip slightly and slumped against his shoulder instead of his throat. Aren't I safe now? I feel safe. You were there too quickly. Can you move super fast or something? Landry called me when he realized that you'd already left. He expected you to tell him. He's quite upset about it. He feels responsible for your safety. I pushed away from him because there was something in there, an accusation. And when I looked in his eyes, I could see that Landry wasn't the only one upset. The only warning I had was to stay out of Border Town. The gardens should be safe. That's where my mother worked. I wanted to go early to think and not have to cry all over you. If it wasn't safe, you probably shouldn't have suggested a date there. He studied me thoughtfully. I should have been more clear. You're safe with me. Without me. He frowned furiously and kissed me, his lips hard but his hands soft as they held me, as though I were the lightest thing in the world. Precious, delicate and perfect. I wrapped my hands around him, tangling in his hair while I kissed him back. He'd stopped walking. For a few minutes the rest of the world diminished in importance until a car honked a half-dozen times. I pulled away, turning to see my brother Bas behind the wheel of Orion's car. Another car behind that. Francis at the wheel. Orion sighed. I suppose I should thank them instead of being angry at the interruption. Are you injured? I swallowed and tried not to feel so dizzy and just good from him, but I couldn't help it. I gave him a very small smile. Yes, just my wrist and my leg. Not bad for my first rumble with a vampire. So aren't they supposed to not be able to wander around in the sun? He stared at me unblinking. She hurt you. His hands became iron around me, hard and unyielding until I winced, and he softened his grip, walking quickly to lower me over the side of the convertible to the seat. Ba take Vi to Candlestick. Don't stop for anything. Francis and I will secure the monsters. I gripped his coat when he tried to pull away. You're going back there? I left them manacled in the shrubbery of a public garden. Do you think that I should leave them there for a gardener to find? I scowled at him. This was supposed to be our big date. I wasn't sure why that came out, but I'd been looking forward to it, and now he was going to go back and I was going to go to Candlestick without him, and with Sebastian. Francis and me can take care of it, Bia said, trying to be helpful. Orion looked at him, an icy glance. No, you can't. I have to take them alive and uninjured to be judged by the CM. We have something called law and order here, and as the butcher I make certain that everyone has their chance at justice. Transporting a werewolf and a vampire like that are not errands for butcher's boys. I trust that you will not get creative with this extremely important errand, that of taking Violetta safely back to Candlestick. Can you do so? He sounded positively furious, and Ba visibly withered beneath his glare, but he rallied valiantly. Yes, sir. I can. He shifted down and drove off, ripping my fingers from Orion's coat without any hesitation. I punched him in the shoulder and twisted around to look back at Orion. The way he watched me, his face icy and terrifyingly angry, eyes burning after me, made my heart constrict painfully. I turned and resolutely faced forward. No sense staring at him when he'd so clearly ended our date. Not that I could blame him. I definitely did not want some innocent person to stumble on those dangerous creatures. Vi, don't be mad, Bess cajoled. You shouldn't have gone to the garden without telling anyone. You're important now, and if something happens to you, Orion will probably go on a killing spree or something. I frowned at him. Excuse me? Are you saying that Orion's homicidal and mentally unbalanced as well as psychopathic? He rolled his eyes. Don't be stupid. It's just that's how I felt, killing all the werewolves I could, whether they were following the rules or not, because of what they did to Mom and Dad. It's a natural reaction. Since when is murder a natural reaction? Not that it would be murder, would it? I mean, werewolves and vampires aren't human, are they? But then why do they have human girlfriends? I don't know. Why are vampires going around during the day? It was a vampire, wasn't it? She had fangs and everything. He put his hand over mine. Vi, calm down. Tell me what happened from the beginning. I took a deep breath and for a second clung to his fingers until I felt his energy. Automatic guilt had me pulling away. I could not take energy from BS. I went to the garden down by the pond, just sitting on a bench, when some cloaked vampire lady came up and started chatting. When she grabbed me, I stabbed her face with garlic-infused toothpicks. That was gross. And then she threw me into the woods, and I think she was going to kill me, but a werewolf came and attacked her. They didn't seem particularly friendly. While they were ripping each other apart, I snuck away, climbed the wall, and ran into the middle of the road. Called Orion, and he came really quickly. That's it. He nodded thoughtfully. She wasn't trying to kill you, or you'd be dead. Also, that she didn't put you under her compulsion probably means that she was trying to be friendly. Friendly? K-12. He grinned at me. You stabbed a vampire in the face with toothpicks? You are so weird. Haven't you heard of knives? Knives don't fit in my bag. You need a bigger bag. I rolled my eyes and sagged against the seat. So, you think that if the vampire wanted to kill me, I'd be dead? Oh yeah, he said reassuringly. Like that was reassuring. Idiot. She's one of the ancient ones, or she wouldn't be prancing around during the day. She must have lost control when you stabbed her face. He laughed and ruffled my hair, hurting my neck. That's funny. I shook my head, but a slight giggle came out. Funny? Not exactly, but ludicrous, impossible, and my brother's reaction completely insane. Now I feel much better. Yeah, see? They weren't actually trying to kill you. You weren't in any real danger. Probably just wanted to talk to the girl who saved the werewolves. You're like a novelty or something. Like the bearded lady. Exactly. Thanks, Beast. I can always rely on you to say exactly the wrong thing. Hey, why didn't Mom want me to know about this world? I could have some coping mechanisms that aren't toothpick related. I could be some ninja warrior or something. He glanced at me, his light green eyes skeptical. You've always been pretty. Scary with your rolling pin, not to mention chef knives, but you know you're
no butcher.
I scowled at him. As far as I knew, there were no butchers, bakers either. Why didn't Mom want to tell me? I should have known not to wander around on the north side or in the garden, apparently. He shrugged uncomfortably. She wouldn't say. All Dad said was that being a baker is tough. I thought he meant like physically or emotionally, the whole pouring your energy into baked goods for other people to consume, and you were tired after you baked for me, so I guess it made sense to me that Mom just didn't have enough energy to feed a bunch of butchers. You knew her. She didn't want to talk, she wasn't going to. So, he said, giving me a suggestive look. How are things going with Orion? Is he giving you enough energy? I punched his shoulder. He didn't flinch, just grinned at me. That good, huh? Do you need any help with him? I mean, after you helped with Olivia, she's been much happier with me. I snorted but actually thought about it. I licked my lips. Do you think I should keep doing this baker thing? His eyes widened. You're thinking about quitting? What about Orion? I was just attacked by vampires on what was supposed to be our first date. This is what they're all going to be like, then I'm done. Maybe I should find somewhere to go to college far away from here. He glanced at me before focusing back on the road. He drove differently than Orion, more careless and unfocused. I don't know. I've always been a butcher. I mean, even when I didn't change over, my instincts were violent and vicious, but always unsated, so that left me kind of grumpy. But it's who I am. Ever since Orion let me into his boys, I've felt at home. You've always baked, Vi. You've always baked for me and Dad, whether you knew about it or not. You're not going to stop. It's not something you do, it's who you are. Think what's bugging you is that you're such an overachiever, and you're not baking and training for a meet and taking 5 more classes than everyone else, and whatever else you do. I've noticed that you seem happy, at least happier than you've been since Mom and Dad died. Landry's pushing you and you're focusing on this baking thing more than you ever have before, except maybe right after the accident. All you did is bake for weeks. So what I'm saying is that you should realize and probably tell Orion that baking, while part of you, isn't enough. That you'll need other outlets because you're crazy. I sighed and slumped down. That was true. Baking was a compulsion for me, and if I ran away I'd still be baking but give my goods to random strangers like Armand, who didn't give me the strength I desperately needed in return. It was also true that I tended to be an overachiever who didn't know how to relax. I closed my eyes and tried to visualize my perfect future, but my leg throbbed in time to my beating heart. My neck was also bruised and pulled from her, grabbing me as well as my arm. I just met a vampire. A friendly vampire. My toothpicks had only made her angry, and the compulsion thing, so she could have gotten into my head like a vampire had gotten to Mal, turning me into a psycho killer who betrayed her best friend. I should call Chloe. I hadn't talked to her for weeks. She called often right after my parents died, but I hadn't really reached back. I pulled out my phone, scrolled down, and hit her number. It rang a few times, and then I heard her voice, sounding happy and tinny and very far away. Violetta Tansetta, are you kidding me? I thought you had fallen off the face of the earth. Don't say it. You know, I actually met someone who thought the earth was flat, so it is possible. Where there is will, there is way. What are you doing? Going home after a vampire attack. I'm baking, actually. I have a mentor and I'm learning the most amazing stuff. She was quiet for a second. Right, because your brother went to school, so you won't go to college until next year. You're still coming here though, right? I chewed on my bottom lip. This wasn't a conversation I was emotionally prepared to have. To be honest, probably not. She sputtered for a second. Chloe never had a problem saying what was on her mind. It's one of the things I loved about her. You're the smartest, most motivated girl I've ever met. Don't tell me that you're quitting on your dreams. I know it's hard since your parents died, but you can't give up on yourself. I'm not. It's just right now isn't the best time. So you're working in a bakery? I know that you and your mom did a lot of bonding that way, but you're not going to bring her back by baking. I flinched while my heart ached so hard I couldn't breathe for a second. Chloe, I've got to go. Wait, Vi, I didn't mean it that way. I'm just worried about you. You have too much potential. I don't want you to throw it away. Thanks, Chloe. I know. Are you coming to town for the holidays? We should get together. Somewhere there weren't any vampires. Really? Yes. We can do a movie or go shopping or just talk. I'm working on the most amazing project with my advanced chemistry class. You'd love it. I agreed and then we hung up. I was left staring at my phone with a sigh on my lips. The girl she wanted me to be had died with my parents. I curled my knees up to my chin and wrapped my arms around my legs, wincing when I brushed my left calf. I couldn't breathe for a second. It hurt in vampires and werewolves. And Orion and I put my head on my knees and tried to breathe, but the adrenaline was gone. And all I was left with was terror and pain. Hey, it's okay. Bess put a hand on my shoulder, but I only whimpered like a pathetic thing. Vi, it's not a big deal. You're fine. Don't cry. You're supposed to be tough. You know, holding it all together. He drove faster as though arriving at Candlestick would somehow make everything okay. I looked up at him, at my idiot brother who thought killing vampires was awesome, so much fun. Was there some place we could go and be safe from the vampires and werewolves and whatever had killed our parents? But what about all the innocent people who needed protection? He was like a police officer in the line of duty. What did that make me? A deputy? I closed my eyes and shrunk down in my seat, glad that Orion wasn't there to see me like this. By the time we got to the enormous Gothic manor, I'd found a tissue in my pocket and had mopped up my face. So much for my cute date makeup. Landry was waiting for us at the top of the drive, and before Sebastian had come to a complete stop, he scooped me up and carried me into the house. Landry. I tried to hold myself away from him, but he carried me like he'd heft a bag of wheat or oats. Orion called, said you were injured. It's not a big deal. He raised a golden eyebrow and met my eyes for the first time. His eyes were clearly concerned and I felt guilty for absolutely no reason. If it wasn't a big deal, you shouldn't mention it to Orion. He might overreact. He carried me through the house like that had settled that, which it hadn't. But the weird thing about Landry hauling me around was that it wasn't weird. Just felt like a sack of flour that needed to be put somewhere. He put me down on the kitchen table, cleared of any baking like it was waiting for me, and then folded his arms across his chest. He did have impressive forearms. Where does it hurt? Oh, here, I said, pointing to my neck and jaw. My arm and my leg. Left calf. I hit a tree. Or she threw me into a tree, but whatever. He pulled out a knife and cut through my jeans from my knee down to my cuff. In one fast movement like he was filleting a fish. I stared at him stunned. These are my favorite jeans. Do you know how hard it is to find a perfect pair of jeans? He ignored me, instead lifting my ankle in his hand and turning my leg so I could see the welt and bruising that covered it. I stared at the leg, at the fact that it looked a lot like someone had tenderized it with a mallet, and felt slightly dizzy. Man, Vi, that's disgusting. I looked up to see Sebastian in the doorway like I hadn't had worse injuries in my years of gymnastics. No one asked you, bro. Get ice, Sebastian, Landry said in a clipped voice. Get a towel as well. He looked up into my eyes, a frown between his brows. The thing about being a baker is that you are incapable of healing quickly by eating baked goods. The only way you'll heal is if you take the energy of a butcher. She can take mine, Sebastian offered, coming over with 3 ice cube trays in his arms as well as a handful of towels. Landry looked at him with a frown while he considered. He put his hand on Sebastian's face, gripping it for a moment before he shook his head and turned back to me. Your brother's energy is sporadic. You need something richer. Excuse me, but I'll need to take a look at the injuries before they're healed. The CM's voice was deep and low, so much like Orion's but with a hint of formality that Orion lacked. Landry grinned at me and I had the idea I knew exactly what he was about to say. Sure, CM. Come on in. He pulled off my jacket, carefully so it didn't get caught on my sore arm. He held my arm by my wrist and elbow, turning it to reveal the print of the vampire's hand. It wasn't only a bruise, but the skin was slightly white as if burned. If you were capable at taking energy as a baker, you could have killed her in this touch. As it is, the reaction from her energy and yours left you burned. He lifted my chin and turned my head back and forth while the Sim peered at my neck, jotting down notes before he nodded and stepped away, already having looked over my arm and leg. Hold on there, Landry said as the CM turned. She needs to learn to take energy. Also, if she's not improved before your son sees her, He'll get unbalanced. The Sim paused, turned his head to peer at me, his hair neatly pulled back with spectacles balanced on his nose, diminishing the warmth of his brown eyes. Certainly. Landry grabbed my hands and put them on the Siam's face. Hi, I said lamely. His energy was like an ocean, rich and dark with endless depths that I could take if I wished. The thing was, I didn't wish. I wanted Orion, not his dad who hadn't really talked to me the whole time I'd been staying at Candlestick. He didn't really like me even if he did feel like he had to put up with me for saving werewolves or whatever. At the same time, if this was my greatest defense, then I would learn it. I would learn it until I could take care of myself and not have to creep around the edges of this world. Because all I had was a handful of toothpicks to hold back the darkness. I took a deep breath as if I were about to launch myself up and around the uneven bars, my most difficult event. I concentrated on that energy, focused on that force that swirled inside of him and tugged on it, trying to move the enormous mass of it. After a few minutes of struggling, I dropped my hand and wiped my forehead with my arm. Ouch. Wrong arm. Try again, Landry commanded. I chewed on my lip and inhaled shakily. Sure. You can actually get his energy to move? It's so heavy. He raised an eyebrow. Is it? He gripped the Siam's face and cocked his head. For a moment, as if listening to something like the mechanisms inside a lock. He was trying to pick. Don't move it, drink it, or drown in it, whichever analogy makes more sense to you. Try again. He released the Siam's face while the man with so much wealth and power stood there, as though Landry had commented on the weather or something else as insignificant and ordinary. Do you mind? I asked the Siam. If I was going to do this, he'd have to look at me and talk to me. That's what helped with Mal and Olivia, if they were focused on me while I focused on their energy. No, little baker. I don't mind. He smiled, a small smile that was nothing like Orion. Somehow that helped a little bit. He wasn't Orion. His energy wouldn't be the addictive kind that made my mouth water. Don't call her that, Landry corrected. Miss Tansetta will do. I shook my head, trying not to get distracted by Landry. I had to touch the Siam myself. I reached out and put my fingertips on his temple before I pulled away and frowned at him. Are you stressed out? He looked back evenly. The season of darkness can be stressful, yes. I bit my lip because hello, stupid thing to say, but I lifted my chin and continued. It's just that I used to take energy from my father, but he'd have me rub his shoulders. Would that be weird? Not at all. He turned and dropped into a chair, leaving the back of his neck exposed. I put my hands on his shoulders, and the lack of skin made it possible to exhale the breath I'd been holding. I closed my eyes and pretended it was my dad. I missed him so much. I buried my fingers in his muscles, finding the tension and releasing it while drawing that tension, that energy into me. Was a little awkward from my position on the table, but after working on him for a few minutes, I felt much better. That's good. Probably shouldn't delay the trial any longer. Landry pulled my hands off the Siam, letting me come down to earth with a shock. For a moment, the grief I held for my father had completely disappeared. I blinked at the Siam, who gave me another slight smile. His eyes were warm and serious as he spoke. Violetta, I hope you know that you're welcome here. Very welcome. Sometime very soon we'll have to discuss the conditions of your internship as well as your future plans. He took my hand, squeezed my fingers, and then turned to leave the kitchen with all of us staring after him. Could that possibly be the same person I saw eviscerate 4 zombies in one strike? Sebastian broke the silence with his legendary wit and tact. Landry scowled at him. Are you still here? Don't you have something to do? Butcher's boy. Sebastian got up from where he'd been sitting at the table eating rolls. Yes, sir. He turned and headed out, leaving me on the table while Landry rummaged in his cabinet, the one he kept polar bear placenta tablets in. Yep, he got out that big bottle, but some other things as well. Put out your tongue. I obeyed and wrinkled my nose as whatever potent tincture fell on my tongue. He frowned at me. Shouldn't have sent your brother off. I need to get some herbs from the garden. I'll be fine. He studied me for a long moment before he nodded, turned and hurried out of the kitchen, taking a knife and a metal bowl with him. I was fine. I sat in the pleasantly warm kitchen, the smell of bread baking in the wood stove filling the room while the bitter aftertaste lingered on my tongue. Vampires. I shook my head and gently touched my leg. It looked a little better maybe, but it felt much nicer. Maybe it was numb from the ice. Landry would put a poultice on it like my mother did after I had a gymnastics injury. I missed her so much. When Landry came in and blended up the enormous comfrey leaves, making a paste out of it with oil liberally sprinkled with other herbs, I felt kind of almost like I belonged there. Watching him pause in his mixing to take the fresh bread out of the oven before continuing to mix reminded me of my mother. If he felt like my mother and Orion's dad felt like my father, did that make this butcher world some kind of home